You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item, plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.
All right, everybody, March 19th, 2025. The Kennedy files are out, or are they? Some of them are out. It's big in the news, so you knew we were going to talk about it. We had to bring on perhaps right now the best man working in the biz, Mr. Cory Hughes, author, researcher extraordinaire. CoryHughes.org is the website. His book, A Warning from History, and his podcast, Cory Hughes, Bloody History. Thanks for coming back, Cory. How you doing, man?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got a lot of inquiries since yesterday about what we thought about the files, and it's like, oh, I've only read 80,000 of them. I haven't been able to read all 100,000. So I don't know how far you've gotten yet, Cory, but what's your take on all this?
I've been just randomly skipping through them to see what's throughout the body of them, and they're all exactly as I predicted. I said that they were all going to be about Cuba and Mexico City and Russia, and these are all red herrings. These are irrelevant files. They have nothing to do with anything. I haven't seen anything that has had any substance to it whatsoever. I mean, the absolute lack of substance to me has been shocking in just a few, maybe 50 or 60 documents that I quickly flipped through. They're not going to give us the good stuff because here's the thing. The good stuff is going to embarrass the country on a scale that's going to be a national security issue, period. So they won't release things like employment records, travel records. I need to know where David Morales was on paper. I need to know where Ted Shackley and George Joanides were on paper, because I'll tell you, they were in Dealey Plaza, and the papers might show that. They might be out for travel or something, but when you have a bureaucracy like that, everything's documented somewhere. And so we need to know where they were on paper. And they're not going to give us that. And if they fake those documents, then we definitely need to see that, right? So there's major problems. They'll never be able to give us these things. And further down the line, down the rabbit hole, what you end up with are documents that will reveal CIA tradecraft secrets, and they won't release those either. That's basically most of Oswald's life is gone. You're not going to get it because of the tradecraft involved, and they can't release to other countries how they do their stuff, right? So, yeah, we got the same old fluff. I don't even know what's special about these documents. There's been nothing in there that's been revelatory. Nothing that like even supports any kind of claims. I have no confidence that any of these are going to have anything worthwhile. And the things that I look for that are worthwhile are not what everyone else looks for. I look for maybe documents that will corroborate dates and times where somebody was, things like that. That might seem it's not a big deal when you read the document, but it's a big deal to me. You know what I mean? So yeah, there's a lot of things like that eventually, when it's put up into a database, I will do specific searches for what I'm looking for, and I'm probably not going to find anything. But yeah, we got the same old fluff we've been getting. None of the documents have had any relevance to anything. Plus, we get a lot of, and I've already seen a couple of these, best known copies. That's a quote, best known copy. That means they've released a document 5 times before, but each time it's a little clearer of a print, and that's what they do. They put stuff out and they say this is the best known copy, and so it's a new document, and that's just not a new document. So,
or they redact a little bit less, like they'll release a version that has a little bit less redactions. One thing I will say I have noticed is that there seems to be less redactions in this release. So whether or not that really means anything in the long run, I thought that was at least encouraging to see.
Yeah, but the documents as a whole, I don't know what Like when Trump said that he saw them and they were horrible, and Kash Patel said the same thing. I don't know what they're talking about. Those guys don't know enough about the actual assassination or the history to understand what they're looking at. Right. Nobody does. Exactly. None of these freaking people who look at these documents before release has any idea what they're looking at.
Right. Trump was asked about it at the Kennedy Center. Have you read them? He's like, no, but I've heard about them. I've been told about them, Cory, And then he said to Judge Napolitano, Judge, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't release them either. Okay. It's like, what the hell is he talking about there?
I think he was doing his bit there that he does, his bluster when he kind of exaggerates a little bit, because Rogan asked him about it, and I don't think it's really that bad. I think it's maybe more benign. I don't think it's going to be that bad. So we're going to get them all out. But I did see one interesting one, Cory. I don't know if you saw this, where it was highlighted and it referred to Angleton and his connection to his closeness to Mossad in Israel. Did you see that one?
No, but that's a pretty well-established fact already. I mean, they got a dinky little forest named after him in Israel. One of his best friends was a known Israeli spy. I mean, I was saying this yesterday. I pay the connections at the top of the pyramid are obvious, right?
Yeah.
And I don't really put a lot of time into them because we all know from Ben Gurion to the Mossad through Angleton and Dulles and CMC and Permindex and all this stuff, right? So the connections are there. So I spend all of my time on the bottom of the pyramid, the very nitty gritty,
mechanics,
the micro details, which is where the real mystery lies. So, and that's one thing that keeps me going is the mystery, right?
Yeah.
So,
and what I heard you say the other day, Cory, on I think it was Shields' show, how you talked about Yitzhak Rabin being in fucking Dallas on the day of the assassination. Dude, I didn't even know that. I had never caught that before, man.
His wife actually admit that in a
it's in her memoir.
It's in her book.
So can you elaborate a little bit on that, Cory, who Yitzhak Rabin was for people who don't know, and what is the seriousness of a figure like him being on Dallas on the day of Kennedy's assassination?
Sure. At the time, he was like a top military official, and he flew into the Air Force Base. But he will go on to be really the head of the Mossad and then Prime Minister of Israel. You see, they had on paper Mir Amit as was the guy on paper who was the head of the Mossad. But he's a really minor player. When you look at who was the major players in Israel in those days, you're talking about Rabin and Shamir and Menachem Begin, who all were in America 3 weeks before the assassination. So you have to understand the backstory, really. Like the LA mob and the Israeli Jews were like peas in a pod. By 49, Mickey Cohen, his personal rabbi, was Menachem Begin, right? And so that's a major connection there. 14 years later, the assassination happens. And over that time period, Mickey Cohen got drawn more and more into the Israeli side of things than the mob, which pissed a lot of people off. He was doing more for Israel than his own Italian brethren, right? And so 3 weeks before the assassination, they're living in Los Angeles, Begin and Shamir. And they send Al Gruber to go meet with Jack Ruby.
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item. Plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.
That's 3 weeks before the assassination. The first phone call Jack Ruby makes after Oswald is arrested, when Oswald was supposed to die in that theater. But he didn't die because one of the cops dropped the gun on the floor. You don't read that in any of the statements except for one. So allegedly inside the theater, Oswald pulls out the handgun and then everyone wrestles over it and then he gets arrested. Well, that's not what happened. He never had a handgun. It was brought in by the cops, and one of the dummies actually did drop it on the floor, and that's what caused him to not get killed in the theater. But he was supposed to die in the theater, and when he didn't die in the theater, Jack Ruby calls Al Gruber. It's the first phone call he makes. And people who interacted with Jack Ruby around that time said that he wasn't himself at all, like he was earlier in the day. He was like a ghost. That, to me, is the moment when he got the order to kill Oswald from Al Gruber when he called him after Oswald was arrested. He knew Oswald had to go, and Jack Ruby had been diagnosed with cancer in the 1950s. So they knew he was on the way out anyway. I think that's why he got the order to kill Oswald. He got super cancer in jail is just more propaganda.
Yeah. Wasn't he in debt too, though, Cory, to a certain extent?
I mean, he's a guy who's in debt who walks around with $2,000 or $3,000 in his pocket. So, I mean, you tell me.
And Rabin is one of these guys who's like an OG of the state of Israel when they were founded on terrorism, like the Irgun and the Haganah and all those groups, along with Begin.
Yeah.
So these guys are foundational godfathers of, the terrorism and founding of Israel, which then extends into mafia links. And then you also made this interesting point how the mafia kind of ceased to be a mainly Italian-centric enterprise into a Jewish, Israeli, Zionist enterprise.
Right.
In what year did you say that was? Like
well, that happened, really, the takeover happened in 1931. It was Meyer Lansky and his crew, Lucky Luciano and Albert Anastasia and Lepke Buchalter and all the Jews, right? They basically put out the hit on Sal Maranzano in 1931 and Joe Masseria, the top two Sicilians who ran the show for 10 years. And after that, it was pretty much Meyer Lansky's show. So he created the network of 5 families in New York, right? The commission. He started all that stuff and kept his name out of it.
Right. So the Italians were largely window dressing and front people.
And they were local. They ran the local stuff.
Local mafias.
They did all the local stuff. But the international syndicate was most certainly run by Meyer Lansky, who had connections all over the world, right? He was the guy who brought in all the big money. So
was that assassination? Sorry to cut you off. Just before I forget, was that assassination connected to supposedly Oswald's uncle, Dutz Moret, or wasn't he?
Dutz Moret was the bodyguard. Dutz Moret. Now you're talking about
a New Orleans connection.
Paul Polo Voitier. Paul Voitier was Oswald's mother's uncle, and he was one of Huey Long's bodyguards who took out Huey Long.
Right.
So it's an interesting connection there. I discovered that because I was studying Oswald's family. I went like 7 or 8 layers deep into Oswald's family. And when you do that, you find all kinds of stuff.
I mean, that thing from 1941 that you mentioned recently about his mother, right? About Marguerite being connected to some kind of military installation or intelligence. What's go into that a little bit?
So this to me is the most important stuff there is. Like, to me, this is the Oswald story in its origin. So this has all been covered up. When you dig into like the Marguerite Oswald background, you won't find any of this stuff, but she gave us enough clues to be able to put this story together. Sometime around 1941, she ended up in New York or New Jersey, and there was a House Un-American Affairs Committee file on her that was basically an Office of Naval Intelligence file that was referenced in this, and then it ended up in the reference to this 986-page Office of Naval Intelligence file ended up in an Office of Security file at the CIA. And in this file, it references Marguerite Oswald, New Jersey, and Nazis. And that's all we know about it. So ultimately, when you look at her, when you look at the addresses she claims to have lived at, a bunch of them are bad addresses. They don't make sense, especially for Algiers, Louisiana, where she was supposed to have been living. But they make perfect sense for New York. The addresses she gave of 2136 Broadway and 227 Atlantic Avenue in Algiers. These are known addresses in New York City. Okay. And when you look into, she admitted at the testimony at the Warren Commission that she had been a phone operator for the Navy in Algiers, Louisiana in 1941. That admission alone has a dozen implications too. Because if you were a phone operator and a woman in the Navy in America, in 1941, you were part of the WAVES program. The WAVES program was the civilian program that recruited civilian women to work, administrative tasks and run phones and, do that kind of stuff while everyone else was over in the war, right? So they had a massive need for staffing. And so when she admitted that she was a phone operator, she inadvertently admitted that she was part of the WAVES program. And where I put her up in New York is right up the road from the training center for the Waves program in the Bronx. So to me, 2 + 2 = 4. She was involved somehow with the Navy starting in 1941. This came to an end around April of 44 when she marries a guy named Edwin Ekdahl, who she had met up there, who was an intelligence contractor who worked with a company called eBook. eBook built power stations, and they built a power station in the Soviet Union. So there's most certainly an intelligence connection there. When he got divorced from Marguerite Oswald in 48, his lawyer was Fred Korth. Fred Korth was the Secretary of the Navy. Fred Korth was directly involved with Oswald's life from the time he was a child. And he basically was the one who was responsible for getting him out of the Marines, getting him out of the Soviet Union. And he is completely he's a big shot. And also, not only that, several of the addresses that are connected to Marguerite Oswald were owned by people who were directly connected to Fred Korth. So Fred Korth was definitely involved in this Oswald scheme going back to the time that he was a child. He knew the family from the get-go. And I have some conflict with dates because the earliest anomaly I start to have with Oswald is in 45, but it involves Ekdahl. Oswald's supposed to be in Boston all through Christmas till about February, but I have school records showing that he started at the Benbrook Common School October 31st. So we have some missing records or some conflict in time, or, that's the first anomaly. And then those anomalies of Oswald being in two places at once stretch through the end of his life. Particularly, there's another couple periods, 1948. Marguerite Oswald and her son Lee allegedly live at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, Texas. Witnesses saw them there for over a year. But I can confirm to you that Marguerite Oswald lived there with all three of her sons and only for 2 months in the end of 48 after Oswald and his mother allegedly lived there. But they were provably in Dallas at that time. This is just another example. Then you get to New York. New York is a complete cluster of contradictory information with Oswald being a truant in school. The addresses he allegedly lived at are questionable at best. Neighbors never saw them there. So we have possibly fabricated addresses in New York. We definitely have some shenanigans around school records, combinations of school records put onto one paper by the FBI. So the whole time period, basically from the late 52 all the way through 56, is about a 4-year period involving New York and New Orleans that are just completely riddled with Oswald being in two places at once and having two different sets of descriptors and everything.
Okay. So what in your mind, Cory, would be the inspiration to essentially create somebody who is going to be used for identity transfer in the intelligence?
This is a primitive Cold War plot to get a spy in the Soviet Union. That's simple.
Okay. And do you think the guy Marguerite married had a lot to do with aiming Oswald in that direction and creating that?
Yes, 100%. I can't really place how because there's not a lot of information on him. I've done all the genealogy stuff, pulled records on his kids, on all, The best I can do is I've found contradiction in where he said he was living at certain times. He's supposed to be from Boston or a place called Newton, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston.
Oh, yeah.
But I basically I can put him most of his life in New York City. So I don't know where that Boston stuff comes from.
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forests, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item. Plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.
So there's a lot of weird stuff like that. You know what I mean?
And then you have Marguerite, all these houses that are under her name, even though she was poor and had to work at department stores. And so how does she own 2 and 3 houses but live somewhere else, right? Isn't that part of it?
Absolutely. And so also not only that, once Oswald's father died in August of 39, she got, according to her, she got $5,000, but a friend of hers said she got $10,000. So she got somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000. And back then, that's like, 20x that money. And so she had plenty of money that should have lasted well through 42, 43, which she actually writes on an application to the Bethlehem Orphanage. She writes that she had this money and it's lasted this long. And then we're talking December 26, 42. So she basically is saying that she took all this time off. But then we have statements from her sister that said she went back to work right away. I mean, there's like, it's when you read the testimony of Lillian Moret, who's her sister, it is just a minefield of disinformation and contradictory information. And where was she living? Where was she working? Oh, I don't know. I don't remember, here and there. And, so basically what you have is Oswald is dumped with Lillian Moret for a period of about close to 3 years. About a year of it he'll spend in the Bethlehem Orphanage with his 2 other brothers. So we're talking around 1943, a time when Marguerite Oswald should still have some of that money left over. She doesn't have any of her kids, but yet we don't have a work record for her during that year, and we don't know what the hell she's doing, right? This is a common theme throughout Marguerite Oswald's life. Then you have the ultimate contradiction where suddenly in 1953, despite only having ever worked for an insurance company and a bunch of department stores, all of a sudden she's a nurse. And there's no record of her going to school to be a nurse or training to be a nurse or any of that stuff. But starting in 53, we have witnesses who say that she was a nurse. Doesn't make any sense, right? So this is the story of Oswald. This is, and I don't really have a lot of answers. I have a ton of the right questions, but this is the whole story of Oswald's life from like 45 till the end. It's just nothing but riddled with contradictions. Makes me believe it's like one big Kaiser Sose.
Yeah, and I got to say that the woman that's presented in those early photographs looks nothing like the old lady from like 62, 63, 64 of the Marguerite Oswald that we see giving the interviews and, photos from history. So that's weird too. It's like, it's almost like the family is related to intelligence and like a construct in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And the cousin and the aunt were going to different countries too, right?
Right. So, so the Lillian Moret, I start finding travel records for her in September 54. Her and Dorothea Moret, the daughter, Marilyn Dorothea Moret, she got her passport in like July, and then she goes to an Air Force base in Bermuda.
Right.
This was new records. No one's ever found this stuff. I found it digging through files on Ancestry.com. And so...
You guys, Cory, so we said we were going to talk about the documents, but you don't even need the documents because Cory has read most of Jim Garrison's documents. He's read the mob documents, the Valenti documents.
The best stuff you find, like Ancestry, as of the last couple of years, has some killer stuff. Like so there's millions of pages of documents of travel records, military records, all that stuff. That like places like Ancestry or wherever the hell they are just sitting, waiting to be scanned in. Then once they're scanned in, the computer can analyze the names and assign them to different records, and that's what ends up happening. I found 3 different records on Lillian Moret that no one's ever seen before regarding her passport and travel and all that stuff.
So this is Lee Harvey Oswald's first cousin and aunt traveling out of a U.S. Air Force base in Bermuda.
Correct. And then I have Lillian Moret traveling to Canada and Cuba in 1955. But none of this is ever brought up in the Warren Commission. And then here's a really weird part that I can't figure out, and we'll probably never figure out, but she had some kind of Social Security action in Texas. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a filing or a claim or what, but she allegedly always lived in New Orleans her whole life. And so why does she have a Social Security action in Texas? See, it's weird things like this that scream of intelligence. When things like this don't make sense, it's usually intelligence.
And you eventually run into a wall. There's no more information. The trail kind of dies.
That's exactly where I'm at with all the Oswald youth stuff. There's things I need to clarify and get some chronologies a little more fine-tuned, but I've gone through every document I think I could find pre-59, and that's it. There's nothing else for us to go through, So just big chunks of Oswald's military records missing. That's a given because, I'll give you an example. Daniel Powers, who was his sergeant at Biloxi, testified to the Warren Commission that the class they were in was changed at the last minute.
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream, Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item. Plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.
Right? So there should be a document somewhere that indicates that change of class. We don't have that document, right? So that's an important document to me. And so,
Yeah.
you know, we don't have a lot of stuff like that, like very basic military record stuff. We've got two exhibits, the Folsom exhibit and the Donna Beatty exhibit. One of them is the medical and the other one is supposed to be his complete history, but it's not. We know for a fact that Marine G2 intelligence has massive amounts of files on Oswald, as does naval intelligence, but people aren't even requesting those. People are like, oh, give me the FBI, CIA files, right? Like Defense Intelligence Agency has a ton of files. And if you watch my Harvey Lee video, you'll see that the first half hour or so, I cover about 50 documents at the FBI, and then we're talking about Harvey Lee Oswald, which Peter Dale Scott deemed was he didn't realize that there were two Oswalds. He thought it was a dual filing system, which is correct, but it was a dual filing system to cover for the fact that they knew that there was another Oswald.
Well, wasn't it Angleton who had access to Oswald's either 201 or his whatever the CIA had, where he could move it around, where instead of it going straight through the Russian line, he took it and moved it somewhere else?
You know, I haven't spent much time on Angleton. Like the higher I get to the top of the pyramid, the less interesting it is to me. So,
yeah. But this on the ground stuff, I mean, it's just, Senator Schweiker even said in the 70s, he's got the fingerprints of intelligence all around him. And
the thing that really fascinates me the most is the period of January 54 through July 56. The contradiction in the addresses is so blatant. I mean, I have the statements of Myrtle and Julian Evans, who put Oswald as moving into their apartment at 1454 St. Mary in May of 1954, stayed for an entire year, left in May of 1955. Okay. I have a postmarked address from 126 Exchange Place from November of 1954. So explain that one to me, right? So Robert Oswald testified to the Warren Commission when they left New York in January 54, they went right to 126 Exchange Place. However, everyone else in the world has testified they went to 1454 St. Mary first. That doesn't make any sense. And not to mention, I've got Lee and his mother missing from January to May of 54. I can't find them at all. The Myrtle Evans let slip that they had stayed at her house, at her actual home, 1910 Britannia Street, which doesn't pop up in any of the Marguerite Oswald addresses anyway. That's one line that was let slip in the Warren Commission testimony. But we have, for fact, and Oswald was attending Beauregard starting in January 54, as testified to by Myra DeRoos, and she drove him home to 126 Exchange Place when he got in a fight. So it's like, what's happening here? It's obvious to me at this point, there's two people. And so it's just very frustrating because the vast majority, 90% of Kennedy researchers ignore this entire line of research. Well,
even what's interesting, I've known for a while that he had a half-brother named John Pick, who hadn't seen him for the better part of a decade, and then saw him at Thanksgiving in 62 and was like, he looked gaunt and thin. It didn't look like my brother.
Right, exactly.
So that's weird.
The idea that they would try to pull one over on John Pick to me is stunning. I mean, he's not just some schmo. The guy was in the military for like 12 years at that point. So it's like they're going to pull one over on this guy. And the funny thing is, after John Pick's testimony at the Warren Commission, where he's like, that doesn't look like my brother, there's not another word from him, period, ever.
I think he died around 2000.
Yeah, so you got a good, 35 years that he stayed silent.
Yeah, I mean, Robert obviously always said that he believed that his brother did it. But wasn't Robert also connected to that military or intelligence installation where at a different time, or maybe at the same time, Lawrence Howard and Lauren Hall and Bill Seymour were connected to through
They were stationed
Interpen.
Right, they were working out with Interpen down at No Name Key in the Keys.
Name Key, yeah.
But you have Jerry Hemming, who was running that, being funneled money by the CIA, and Jerry Hemming lived in Opelika and was obviously dealing with the CIA at Opelika, which was a secret military base. At the time that 10 years before the assassination, almost 8 years, something like that, when Robert was actually at Opelika, he was there at the time they were overthrowing Arbens in Guatemala.
And so 54, 53?
Yeah, 53 to 54, exactly.
Wow.
And so that's way before Mockingbird, because Mongoose came in right after that. Right after that, when they started Mongoose, they started it out of Opelika. And so there's a direct connection between Opelika, the CIA, JM Wave Station. This is some of the stuff. Okay, this is in the new documents. There's a couple documents that connect Opelika and JM Wave, which is it's a given, right? So, yeah. But those are new. We haven't seen those. I think that's pretty interesting stuff. But then you really come to understand that Opelika played a key part in this, maybe not in Kennedy, but in the CIA's operation down in southern Florida, where all these guys were associated.
When is it that you think they were decided to wrap Oswald and use him as the patsy? And who do you think played the big role in deciding that this was going to be the guy to take the fall?
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item, plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.
No, that's a good question. I really have no idea. What it comes down to is Oswald came back with a Russian spy. They couldn't have looked at that too favorably. That probably pissed a lot of people off. Because obviously, once she got back, they kind of really didn't have too much involvement with her until the assassination, or so it would seem. But you wouldn't think so, right? You'd think a Russian spy would come to this country and instantly FBI, CIA, immigration, everybody would be all over her instantly.
Wasn't James Hosty kind of looking at her? I think Hosty was more interested in her than he was in Lee.
Hosty is a weird one because he's a liar. He lied about, I've seen, talks he's given. He's lied about Oswald repeatedly. He worked a case regarding George de Mohrenschildt in the 50s. He was connected to de Mohrenschildt in the 50s. So he knew he was more connected to those people than we'd like to think. And so
right. Wow.
There's something shady about him, and I really haven't figured out yet. I haven't spent a lot of time on him, but I've read enough. His name has popped up in other areas of investigation to give me pause. But you would think that a communist defector comes back from Russia with a Russian spy, that the intelligence people would be all over that nonstop. And that's not what happened. Or is it? Because to me, it's clear as day that Marina was involved in the setup. So I get the feeling that when they got back, she got separated or talked to and sat down and was like, look, this is what's happening. And you're going to play along or you're going to go back to Russia. And so she did whatever they wanted. And that's how I think that played out. And then years later, she came out on a couple of those shows on TV saying that's not what happened. You guys don't know what happened and all this stuff. And so she might have felt guilty about it later in life, but she never wrote a memoir about it to tell us what really happened.
Yeah, she's been pretty quiet outside of, she was on Jesse Ventura's show there, about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I don't think I've seen her say or do anything.
She's dead. She's dead. So
Marina, no, she's still alive.
I don't think so.
Her husband died last year. The guy that she literally met she was on a park bench and he came riding by on a horse. He just died in December.
She's still alive?
I think she's 83.
Oh my God.
right?
I thought she died like 10. I thought she died years ago.
No, she's still down in Texas, man. She's
What
down
the
in the
fuck?
Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Bro, somebody needs to like kidnap her and hold her at gunpoint till she talks.
You get her on a podcast.
We're not advocating that, everybody. Cory's just being he's
Hyperbolic.
He's being hyperbolic.
So, I didn't know that. I thought that I had seen that she had died. That's my bad.
Yeah, I guess the last interview she really gave was in the mid '90s to Jefferson Morley, who we have both podcasted with. I'd love to have both of you guys on for a not a battle royale, but a discussion.
He'll deflect everything I say and say it doesn't matter.
Well, look, here's something interesting, Cory, that I mentioned to him the Stuart Reed photographs, and I mentioned Collins Radio, and he just shrugged it off and said that I don't put anything into that. So that was interesting.
The Collins Radio connection is so important because the Collins Radio not only were they the CIA group that installed all of the communications equipment on Air Force Two, Carl Mather, who was one of Tippett's best friends, allegedly, it was his car that was being used by David Ferry when he was driving around in Dallas. So it's to me, it's the connection to Collins Radio is ultra important.
So do you think it was Kerry Thornley who was in the car at the gas station near the Tippett murder scene that the witness saw, where he wrote down the license plate?
100%.
You think that was Thornley?
100%. Kerry Thornley, and he was in Igor Vaganov's red Ford Falcon. Yep. So
I think there was a discrepancy though, because the wife or Carl Mathers himself said, "Oh, it's a different car," but
right, because it was a license plate swap. So, David Ferry is out driving the Gray Plymouth, but it's the red Ford Falcon that had Carl Mathers' license plate on it. Right.
Okay.
So I'll tell you basically about Tippett.
Yeah,
so,
if you want to just break this down for our audience and give a little back on it.
So David Ferry's in the Gray Plymouth. He's on the knoll, then he's behind the book depository, and then he makes his way to the Tippett shooting. And we know he's at the Tippett shooting because we have a witness named Frank Wright who saw a gray little one-seated Plymouth that was parked behind Tippett facing the opposite direction on the street, okay? Tippett kind of pulls in at a funny angle, and the car's facing the other way behind it. And he's ultimately shot by Kerry Thornley and David Ferry. Kerry Thornley will flee to the secondhand junk shop on Jefferson Street. Then he'll go past Dean's Dairy Way, where he's seen by Dorothea Dean, and who she recovers the jacket. But then we have the story of the jacket being found underneath the car in the Texaco parking lot.
By Westbrook.
Right, by Westbrook, of course, of all people. And so that story is debunked by Dorothea Dean, who basically pulled the jacket off a tire rack behind the Texaco and held onto it until police came and got it hours later. So is there a second jacket at play? Probably. But either way, we're getting off the point. So David Ferry, Kerry Thornley will make his way to the Texas Theater, but he'll go in front of Hardy's Shoe Store. And inside Hardy's Shoe Store, you have Johnny Brewer, who's the manager of the store. But there's two other men in that store who no one ever talks about. Tommy Rowe, who was a good friend of Jack Ruby, who actually moved into Jack Ruby's apartment when Jack went to jail, and a guy named Igor Vaganov. These are the two guys in Hardy's Shoe Store. Igor Vaganov is the owner of the red Ford Falcon that Kerry Thornley will be seen in 5 minutes after he's arrested at the Texas Theater. So Kerry Thornley enters the theater at 1:36 p.m., give or take a minute. There's a lot of conflict with the testimony of everyone involved at the Texas Theater, because by the time Johnny Brewer follows allegedly Oswald, but it's actually Kerry Thornley, follows him into the theater, goes looking around, all this stuff, and then goes back and talks to Julia Postal, you have cops showing up on scene at basically, what time would that be? 1:40 p.m. or something like 1:40 p.m. So there's a disconnect between when they called the cops and when the cops show up. The cops showed up before the call could have been dispatched, period.
Pretty quickly.
Yeah, and then the cops who show up on scene, Detective Lyons, I think it was the first one. He calls in on the radio and he says, "Hey, I'm out at the Texas Theater." And then dispatch had to ask him what he had at the Texas Theater because they didn't dispatch him. They had to figure out what he was doing there. So everybody knew to show up at the Texas Theater because it was a prearranged spot. Oswald had been in there since 1:06 at the latest. This was attested to by Butch Burroughs, who was working the Candy case. Oswald will go into the theater and he'll sit down in front of Jack Davis, who's like an 18-year-old kid. And then he gets up and sits directly next to him. And there's only 22 people in this theater. And so Jack Davis is like, "What's wrong with this guy? Why is he sitting right next to me?" And then Oswald gets up, the real Oswald gets up 2 or 3 times, sits down next to different people, eventually sits down next to a pregnant woman. He talks to the pregnant woman for a short time. They both go back to the lobby. The pregnant woman leaves. And then Oswald buys popcorn from Butch Burroughs kind of a weird thing to do if you snuck into a movie theater. This is, 20 minutes before Kerry Thornley will show up at 1:36 p.m. The Tippett shooting is alleged to have happened at 1:16. That's how they stretched out the timeline. And they had to make it so that Oswald had enough time to walk. But Oswald didn't walk. Kerry Thornley was driven from the boarding house to the Tippett shooting by Westbrook and Croy. They were sitting in the alleyway as Tippett was getting shot. They witnessed the whole thing. And then
just back to the boarding house. So was it Thornley staying at that boarding house? Because
Absolutely.
The woman who ran that and owned that was also an associate of Jack Ruby's? Or is that a different...
No, that is correct. That is correct. Her
because
sister,
a big linchpin of the official story is that Lee Harvey Oswald flees the book depository, gets on a bus, then gets in a cab, then goes to the boarding house to retrieve his pistol.
It's all fiction. That's all fiction. None of that happened.
Okay.
So Earlene Roberts is the manager there. Her sister is Bertha Cheek, who's a direct associate of Jack Ruby.
Okay.
Which is funny because at the other boarding house, you have Mary Bledsoe. The other boarding house, Mary Bledsoe was the manager, and Mary Bledsoe's first cousin was R.D. Matthews, who was an associate of Jack Ruby, right? So both of the boarding houses had a direct connection to Jack Ruby.
That's crazy.
It was obviously all arranged by Jack Ruby. What I want to know is where are the CIA contacts to Jack Ruby in Dallas? Which CIA people were interacting with Jack Ruby? Because I don't have that answer.
J. Walton Moore, maybe?
A good possibility. A very good possibility.
That would be my guess.
Yes, he's the FBI/CIA guy, and I don't think the FBI appreciates CIA people working in their positions. So that's a very good possibility there because he was connected to Des Moines Shield also. It's a big network. It's a big orgy of corruption. When you come to see who knew who, everybody knew everybody, really.
Yeah, it's small. Is it true, too, Corey? Do you know anything about this, that Jack Ruby or an associate of his or someone who was in his employ had a house, on the same street as Ruth Payne? Do you know anything about that?
Yes. You're talking about the musicians.
Must be. At the club?
There was a couple guys who were musicians at the Carousel Club, and they had a house literally 2 or 3 houses down from Ruth Payne. So
wow.
That's not something I ever really even think about or bring up, but yeah, that's definitely a reality.
I just saw that the other day. But so back to Kerry Thornley, before we go into more of the stuff with the theater, basically Kerry Thornley was someone who also was in the Marines, and he was in the same unit as Oswald. Or can you give a little bit of backstory to our listeners and viewers about Kerry Thornley and why that's important?
Kerry Thornley's interactions in the Marines end up becoming very complex, and you have to understand the backstory to Kerry Thornley. When you understand that after the assassination, he goes off into this weird kind of Discordian movement, which is Robert Anton Wilson kind of crazy CIA-backed counterculture thing. And when he was involved with David Ferry and them, all the people who knew him described him as a bearded beatnik, right? He had dirty fingernails. And that's how you can always tell him apart from Oswald. Oswald's supposed to have taken a typing class in Dallas 3 nights a week. Marina testified to this. But when you read the statements of the woman who taught the class, she said that Oswald had filthy fingernails. That's not Lee Harvey Oswald. That was Kerry Thornley, too. So Kerry Thornley never took care of his fingernails, and that's one of the descriptors that you see on a regular basis. But Kerry Thornley is in the Marines with Oswald at Santa Ana, which is different from El Toro. It's 6 miles away. It's a helicopter base. They're only together for about 2 months. After that, Kerry Thornley will be sent to a number of schools, the same exact schools Oswald went to, he's following in his footsteps. Now, this wouldn't really be too much of a big deal because they did that a lot. They had classes and groups of classes who would kind of go through the same steps. But Kerry Thornley wasn't on that career path. He was on a career path to be an amphibious assault guy. But all of a sudden, he's pulled out of amphibious assault and he's stuck in aviation electronics at Biloxi. I uncovered his time at Biloxi, but his official record says that he was out in California, but he wasn't. He was in Biloxi. I have a photograph of him graduating in class 24077, which is the basic warning aircraft operator course that Oswald took, right? So he goes through the same courses Oswald takes. Then he gets sent to Atsugi in the same unit Oswald was in, MACS-1. And while he's there, he starts talking to people about Oswald and asking them questions about Oswald. And he's writing it down in a book, and he's taking photographs. And he's using an alias of Rick Thornley. So to me, it's clear he is on a path to become Oswald, basically. I think they sent him through the same courses to learn as much about him, his mannerisms, his behaviors, how he could become Oswald. 2 days or 3 days or something like that, very shortly after Oswald leaves the Marines on September 11th, 59, Kerry Thornley allegedly wins an instructor technique competition in the Marines and is flown from Atsugi to Washington, D.C. He spends 5 or 6 days in Washington, D.C., and then he gets flown back to Atsugi, and then he returns in October. He will later tell people he didn't find out about Oswald leaving the Marines until he was on his way home in that October of 1960. So that's crazy because he's doing an investigation on Oswald, but he allegedly didn't even find out Oswald left to go to the Soviet Union until way later. So he's lying about that, right? He ends up showing up in New Orleans. He goes to Whittier, California, which is seems to be a hotbed of the right-wing militia activity stuff. He ends up meeting up with Lauren Hall while he's out there in Whittier, California.
Really?
Yeah, he showed up at one of Lauren Hall's meetings. Lauren Hall had like a, yep. And Warren Reynolds was also there. Warren Reynolds, the car dealer who was a witness to the Tippit shooting, was also at this meeting in California. Yeah, crazy, huh?
That is crazy.
Warren Reynolds is a right-winger, just like all these other guys, and involved with this somehow, but I haven't spent a lot of time on him. He was just used as a witness, but he was connected to all these guys out in California also, like Lawrence Howard, Lauren Hall, and all the guys. So, but Kerry Thornley, he shows up in New Orleans in around, he says February of 61. I think it's January of 61, because we have the first incident of the impersonations of Oswald occurring in New Orleans at the Bolton Ford, January of 61. And the descriptions, the guy gave the name Lee Oswald, first off. And the descriptions, he was with a husky Latin with a pockmarked face. It was Lawrence Howard. Clearly, the one thing that kind of gave me pause for a long time, because it was always William Seymour seen with Lawrence Howard. But then I find Kerry Thornley mentioned Lawrence Howard in his 50-page confession letter to Jim Garrison. He mentions straight up Leopoldo, and Leopoldo was the alias that Lawrence Howard gave at the Sylvia Odio incident, right? So we've got the connection between them there. And when the witnesses said that they were the same height, that's when I realized it was Kerry Thornley there, not William Seymour. And so you have that incident. And then for the next, 2 years, you've got 2+ years, you have Kerry Thornley involved in the setup of Oswald, impersonating him, getting the flyers printed at Jones Printing, guiding him on what he needs to do. And when Oswald goes to New Orleans in May of 63, Kerry Thornley leaves New Orleans and goes to Whittier, California on his way through Mexico City. Then when Oswald leaves in September, Kerry Thornley comes back to New Orleans. So they swapped kind of places with a 2-week overlap in the beginning and a 2-week overlap at the end, which is really weird. So then you'll have Kerry Thornley identified as Oswald at the party at David Ferry's house by Perry Russo, where he says Clem Bertrand is there and they're talking about killing the president and all that stuff. And so, yeah, Kerry Thornley was a key figure in the setup of Oswald long before the assassination. And like I said before, I think it was a repurposed mission. I don't think the setup of Oswald began until March. The assassination plan wasn't in play until probably a little earlier than March. But all the stuff they're doing with Oswald, to me, seemed to be just another plan to get a spy and probably this time defect to Cuba or something along those lines.
Okay.
Got back from the Soviet Union.
That was going to be my next question. Yeah, what before a plot to kill Kennedy, what would have been the utility and the inspiration and reason for a guy like Thornley and this nexus to
continue the legend, to continue to build this legend of a communist. But when you read Oswald's statements about coming back from the Soviet Union and what he talked to people about, he hated it there. He sucks. Yeah. He's like, this place fucking sucks. So what are you talking about? He's a communist still. No, he was glad to be back in America. I mean, the whole thing is a sham.
Have you seen the quote, Cory, that Kerry Thornley said his Idle Warriors manuscript somehow was read by Clay Shaw?
So the Kerry Thornley.
And then he says, I may have inadvertently been part of the plot or given them the idea or something.
Well, that's all in the confession letter to.
Okay.
That's in the confession letter to Garrison. It's a 50-page affidavit, and he basically connects himself to every person in the assassination. And he's like, I don't know, it was a mystery. I must have just been at the center of it, but I didn't realize it. And so, but it was a confession letter when you actually read it enough times and you see what he's saying. There's no way it's not. But ultimately, when he gets down there, he's instantly connected to a bunch of CIA people. Primarily Kent Courtney, who was a right-wing CIA-funded propagandist who put out like right-wing newspapers. And then you have Martin McAuliffe. Okay, so he meets this girl named Jeannie Hack, and Jeannie Hack introduces him to this professor at Louisiana State University named Martin McAuliffe. Martin McAuliffe allegedly loved Kerry Thornley's book so much, and he thought he was such an intellectual, that he wanted to introduce him to Guy Bannister, and so he does. And so this is the official. This is what Terry Thornley says happened. That Martin McAuliffe is the one who connects him to Guy Bannister, and that Guy Bannister and him sat around and read the book about Oswald. And this is during the summer of 1962. And so Jim Garrison in his notes is like freaking out. He's like, I can't believe it. He's like, we've connected this guy to everybody, and it's only the summer of 62, right? Terry Thornley. But growing up, he was like a super smart nerd. He got recruited, I'm convinced, through this contest called the Voice of Democracy contest while still in high school. And I think the CIA told him to go join the Marines, and that's how the whole thing started for him.
So the repurposing of Oswald and creating the legend and building the legend, when do you think the genesis of the plot to kill Kennedy began? And
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item. Plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.
I think you mentioned before, in your mind, the genesis of it really formed with like the Ben-Gurions of the world.
Yes, absolutely. But everybody involved had their own reason for wanting Kennedy dead. The mafia had their own reason. They were betrayed, because of the deal that they made to steal the election for him. And then you have, the Israelis just hated each other. I don't care what anyone says. He hated Israel. He was going to cut all funding, period. Not only over Dimona, but over everything else. He just fucking thought they were scum.
Well, they were worried that he was going to be like his father, who was an appeaser to Neville Chamberlain during, the precursor to World War II, right? I mean, there's even testimony. I don't know if it was Ben-Gurion who said it or someone said, I'm worried the son is going to be like the father. And then you have the war of letters between JFK and Ben-Gurion. And then
Ben-Gurion resigns, and then the next letter to Levi Eshkol was like the final straw. The plot had already been in place. This is May 63. So the plot had been in place. The rifle had already been ordered for Oswald, so they basically told Kennedy to pound sand, and they were just biding their time. So they're lucky he didn't do anything to them between May and November.
Right. So you put like spring of 63?
Yeah. So allegedly there was a spring meeting of the company Permindex, which I consider to be the oversight board. Permindex was like a Mossad front that had everybody from Alan Dulles and Angleton to Tibor Rosenbaum, mob bosses, Clay Shaw, all these guys. And
didn't they have a son-in-law of Hitler's financier master, essentially?
Yeah. The son of Halmar Schacht.
Yes,
was involved with Permindex. So was Gershon Perez. He was the brother of Shimon Perez.
It's a rogues gallery, man.
It was a total rogues gallery. It had guys from the Corsican Mafia involved. I mean, it was wild.
Their legal bagman in Canada was Louis Bloomfield.
Yes, and he ran Centre Mondial Commercial, which was Michel Meta showed in his book that CMC was directly involved in funding Gladio operations in Italy in 67.
Yeah.
Right, which is wild as shit. So it's almost like I mean, this is a movie. Great. This is a Hollywood movie.
Yeah, it's wild. And there is an intrepid independent journalist, Cory. Maybe you've heard of him. His name escapes me, but he was really digging in to Louis Bloomfield's private papers and files that had been locked away for years. And then the widow had them. And then the date came where he said, X amount of years after I die, then, they can release these. She had it resealed again. So I don't know if you've ever followed up. I've been thinking about that. Have you followed up on that or looked into how far that guy got?
I read a ton of those documents, and this is what I've discovered. Virtually all of them are communications, which are seemingly benign. They just show relationships. But ultimately, what CMC was doing was they were doing nothing more than funding and acquiring stock in companies that had something to do with the Dimona nuclear reactor. Like they invested in like nickel companies. They invested in all kinds of parts companies that would basically be used for the parts at Dimona. And so that's what I got out of reading it.
Interesting. So it's fragments of that and those pieces, because that milieu was involved with NUMEC and Apollo,
right?
And the stealing of the components to build the bomb, which Dawson so brilliantly goes into in his NUMEC documentary, which I tell everyone is really key to understanding this whole thing.
It is, and it's an area of my studies that I didn't really avoid, but it never came into direct contact, because once I made the connections between the LA mob and the Israelis and that relationship in LA, I kind of like moved on from that and didn't. If I would have followed that through, it would have taken me directly to NUMEC and all that stuff. But Ryan had already covered it. I'm like, I'm not going to waste my time. So for me, I do have a big gap in the 1950s of the CIA Mossad relationship surrounding NUMEC, which is probably key to understanding some more of the Jewish angle, because Ryan spent a lot of time on the Israeli angle to the assassination, far more than me. I mean, he was able to put Clay Shaw in Dallas with a guy named Erwin Heyman, who was a representative of the Jewish agency in Switzerland. I can't figure that out, and I've been on that for like 3 years, and I've gone over every document period on Erwin Heyman. I got nothing to connect that, so I don't know where Ryan got it from. But see, he focused more on that angle. I focus more on the nitty gritty stuff.
Now, also like David Ferry and the Clay Shaw Nexus, they were involved in raiding munitions bunkers for munitions that were surplus World War II that would be routed through the rat line to Israel.
Correct. See, everyone thinks that stuff was supposed to go to the anti-Castro Cubans, and the anti-Castro Cubans are another red herring. So they had nothing to do with this. The only anti-Castro Cubans involved in the assassination were Sergio Arcacha and Emilio Santana, and they were just minor players. I mean, shooters, but minor players nonetheless.
Who's the guy that got killed down in Florida? It's even mentioned in the movie JFK. He got like stabbed, cut up, and
you're talking about
Eladio Del Valle.
Eladio Del Valle, yes, Eladio Del Valle. So the rumor is he supplied radio equipment for the assassination. I have no proof of that whatsoever.
Okay.
But see, these guys were involved. The Kennedy assassination, you got to think, really is just one of many things that were going on. There was a lot of other people getting killed over other things. And so it's hard to say necessarily, like, who the hell knows what happened to him? I mean, it sounds like some Cubans got up here and did that to him. You know what I mean?
So when
with machetes.
So Dallas Citizens Council, which Abraham Zapruder was also a member of, were they connected to Jack Valenti and the Samuel Blumen and the advertising group?
Yeah, they were both on the board of the Dallas Citizens Council.
Because that's the group that actually invites Kennedy to Dallas, right?
Well, technically it was Jack. Well, Jack Valenti wrote the letter on behalf of Albert Thomas to bring Kennedy to Texas. And they had the Albert Thomas dinner the night before. And Jack Valenti then from there handled all the press and did all the bookings for all the events they did. And, Jack Valenti was there every step of the way. The Dallas Citizens Council was in charge of the motorcade route and securing the route. And there's a lot of controversy. People say the route was changed. I have no evidence of that. It wouldn't make sense for the route to have been changed. Then I know that the route was announced on November 18th, and it was published by Jack Valenti's company, Weekly and Valenti.
Yeah, and Valenti was really in the employ of Lyndon Johnson.
So the relationship,
a
lackey for sure, 100% a lackey. I'd say closer than right-hand man. They got together in 56, and they were introduced by people at Humble Oil, because Jack Valenti worked for Humble Oil for many, many years. And
you ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forests, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item. Plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.
He started there as a kid, right? Teenager?
Yep, he was like 15.
Like a messenger boy.
Yeah, he got groomed as hell, I'm sure.
So before I saw your work, Cory, when I thought about Jack Valenti, I always just thought about, oh, this is the censorship guy. This is the MPA. This is the MPAA guy. For those who don't know, Jack Valenti, I think he was born in 1920 or 21, and he died in like 06 or 07. So he was around for a long time. And I think Chris Dodd or Chris Dodd's father, or no, Chris Dodd took over the MPAA after him, I'm pretty sure.
It was a guy named Glickman. A guy named Glickman took over after, yeah.
But the larger point is this guy Valenti was in charge of like ratings classification and what you could see, what kind of movies were going to get made and get promoted basically for a long time.
I say that he was the head of the censorship industrial complex before there was a censorship industrial complex. Because not only that, he sat on the board of the Recording Industry Association of America with Charles Bronfman. And they were behind the PMRC. You remember that with the ratings? You had to get the parental advisory sticker on records in the 80s.
Oh, like Mr. Rogers and the other guy. Jack
Valenti was behind that, the whole thing, the whole PMRC.
It wasn't just Skipper Gore.
It was it was funded by the RIAA. It was promoted by the RIAA, which was Jack Valenti, who was one of the longer. He sat on all kinds of boards of companies, TWA. He sat on a board of directors for them, which connects him to Onassis. So it's really unbelievable when you see how many the YMCA. He sat on the national board of directors of the YMCA. You know, it's just crazy stuff. So
yeah, they played it to become Trump's song, actually.
Don't you have, Cory, like a book signed by him or an autograph that he wrote to someone from the House Select Committee or something?
Yeah, I've got a book that he signed to Frank Church. I just bought it because it was a signed book. I didn't realize the inscription. I just bought it because I went on a spree. I bought I bought all the Valenti stuff. So when everyone knows who he is, they can come to me for all the collectibles. So, but no,
what's on the wall behind you?
Those are 2 bloodstained pieces of leather from Kennedy's limo.
Jesus.
Yeah, that cost me a pretty penny.
I don't know what that cost.
That's beyond.
But yeah, I have a book inscribed to Frank Church from Jack Valenti, which is ironic because it was the guy looking for the shooter on the knoll, and his book was signed to him by the shooter on the knoll, which is wild.
So is there any indication or anything you've dug up that anyone heard Valenti or he caught to his involvement to anybody, associates, papers, like anything like that?
Nope. The problem with Valenti and all the stuff, he was very prolific in his later years, and he contradicted himself all the time. You know, he kept changing where he was in the motorcade. His story about where he was during the motorcade falls apart because he was obviously on the knoll, and then he got a ride from the Secret Service to Parkland Hospital. But his story is that he was on the party bus, 24th in line, and that he ended up at the Trade Mart with Mary Gallagher and Marie Femmer and all the secretaries, Evelyn Lincoln, and that they got a ride in a sheriff's car to the hospital. But no, when you go through the statements of those individual secretaries, all 5 of their statements are identical, basically. They all got there. They were kind of upset. They didn't know what to do. And they found a state trooper named Good, Goode. Marie Femmer still had his business card years later. And they all got a ride with him to Parkland Hospital. Jack Valenti co-opted that story. So there's supposed to be, in that story, there's 5 women and 1 guy in a cop car. So that's 6 people in a cop car. Jack Valenti claims he was in there, which would make it 7. And then 20 years later, you have Elizabeth Forsling Harris, tries to give Jack Valenti an alibi, claims she was with him in the cop car, and that her face was pressed against the glass, but that would make 8 people in the car. And none of the secretaries ever mentioned the 2 of them ever.
That's what I was going to ask.
Any of their testimony.
Yeah.
So it's a total lie that he bought off of Evelyn Lincoln, basically.
Yeah. So can you lay out how you put Valenti on the knoll and how you get him there and how that all plays out and what you've researched?
So I had been researching him for probably 2 years very heavily. I've studied his 600-page FBI file. I've read it multiple times. It's goddamn crucial in Kennedy work. And no, I'm the only person who's ever read a damn thing. the thing that tipped me off to Jack Valenti was I caught him in his lies about where he was in the motorcade. And that's how I started to study him. And then I started to read about his mob background and the connections of Humble Oil and George Bush and all this stuff. And I didn't have a smoking gun. I knew he did it. I knew he was the guy on the knoll. I knew all the statements he had said were lies, and I didn't have the evidence. And then I found McIntyre photo number 2, which to me is a clear picture of Jack Valenti on the side of the Secret Service car. And that to me was the icing on the cake. So, and obviously the man next to him was David Morales, who the pictures are identical to his current or to his more modern pictures. So it all fell into place.
We've talked about that before, Cory, and you and Jefferson Morley had a little bit of a going back on the Union of the Unwanted. And I asked Vincent Palomera about that, who's done a lot on the Secret Service. And I think maybe you tried to reach out to him, or you guys had a volley at some point, but he said the 2 people in that photo are Secret Service agent Paul Landis and Secret Service agent Jack Reedy.
Jack Reedy. Yeah, he's an idiot. So, and I'll explain why. Jack Reedy, first off, lies in his statements to the Secret Service and to the FBI. Jack Reedy claims that he got off the Secret Service car and attempted to run to the president's limousine when he was shot, but he was called back by Emory Roberts. And in his own written statement, he acknowledges he entered the Secret Service car in Dealey Plaza. He lied, though, and he says he entered the front row of seats, but he didn't. When you look at McIntyre number 2, there's only 2 agents in the front seat. He did not enter, but he did enter in Dealey Plaza. He entered the 3rd row of seats.
Can you see him in Alchins, the later Alchins one?
Alchins number 7. He's clearly in Alchins number 7. And that's Kennedy at that point's already been shot, and he hasn't gone running to the front of the car like he says he did. So I don't even know what that's about, and it's not seen in the Zapruder film. And so he lied. He got into the 3rd row of seats. Paul Landis lied also, because Paul Landis claimed to have stayed on the side of the Secret Service car under the overpass. But when you look at McIntyre number 1, the picture of the man, there's only one person on the side of the vehicle in that photograph, and he's clearly got a flat top. And it's a kind of a shady picture, but you can see the shape of the man's head and his hair, and it's clearly a flat top, which matches McIntyre number 2. So I did a recent update to my video, and I went over this in excruciating detail with photographs and stuff. The man on the side of the car is not Paul Landis, period.
He was wearing shades, though, that day, correct?
Oh, sure, for sure. But Paul Landis, when he jumps into the car, you can clearly see him in McIntyre 2 in the 2nd row seats. Him and his rounded haircut. He's sitting. He's sitting in the 2nd row of seats between Dave Powers, who I actually made a mistake on. I thought he had exited the vehicle, but he didn't. And it actually bolstered the case because it shows in the picture McIntyre number 2, Dave Powers, and then Paul Landis in the middle. And then you still have in that 2nd row, you have Kenny O'Donnell, who's being blocked. Most of them you can see his kind of shirt and where it meets the jacket. But most of them is being blocked by Bill McIntyre, who's on the outside of the car. So you have 3 people in the 3rd row, 3 people in the 2nd row, and then you have 2 people on the side of the car, 2 people in the front row, and Bill McIntyre on the side. That's 11 people. So
okay. And aside from that photo, do you have any kind of background or information on Morales being in Dallas?
Zero. Nada.
There's a quote attributed to him that said, "I was in Dallas when we got the son of a bitch, and then I was in LA when we got the," or something to those.
He said something to those effects. Yeah, I don't think he mentioned Dallas in that quote, but he did say, "My boys got him," or something along those lines. So, I mean, I think everyone's always known he's been involved because when the CIA needed to do something that everyone else was repulsed by, David Morales was the guy to do it. And so, and he was working with Shackley and Joe Anitas, who were all connected to these guys since, early in the 60s. So,
yeah. What was the quote like?
To me, all the pieces were right there. They're just right there.
If you saw David Morales, Mike, walking in the street of a Latin American country.
If you saw David Morales walking down the capital of a Latin American country, you knew a coup was about to go down.
Right.
That's the quote from another CIA dude.
Right. Yeah, completely. I mean, that guy he was a patriot, though. I mean, he really loved America and I believe that he thought killing Kennedy was a patriotic act.
An act of patriotism. Mm-hmm. Wow. And then the guy who David Ferry threw the rifle to was one of the guys who helped raid those bunkers.
Jerome Blackman. So Jerome Blackman was a friend of his from the CAP, Civil Air Patrol. Mm-hmm. He's in the Merchant Marine at the time. And thankfully, through the references in the David Ferry file, it was pretty easy to determine that Blackman was the man on the boat coming in with the heroin that was going to be picked up by Rose Cheramy and Sergio Arcacha and Emilio Santana. Now, after the assassination, Jack Ruby goes to Galveston. And what I've concluded is that he had to go to Galveston to bring Blackman back to his boat. Blackman will be interrogated Tuesday about the assassination. He gets back on Sunday, and he's interrogated by the FBI on Tuesday. So they knew about him from the jump also.
I was going to say, he's picked up on what basis?
I don't know. There's very scant information on that. There's only references to it in some files, which means obviously those interviews are missing.
And Garrison brought in Ferry the next week, right?
The day after or 2 days after. So Ferry was in Dallas. He never went to the Winterland ice rink or any of that stuff. That was all alibi story. He ends up going directly to Hammond, Louisiana, and then he goes and meets with Garrison on that Monday, the 25th. And Garrison basically arrested him, and he gets turned over to the FBI, and the FBI cut him loose. I don't know how long that interrogation was, but it wasn't long enough. The stories that he tells the FBI are very easily debunkable. He can't remember what order they stopped in, where they stopped. He doesn't know nothing. I mean, it's really hilarious when you read his story and you kind of come to understand what happened. You're like, oh, that guy he was never there.
You think about Joe Pesci. I believe the boys bagged some geese. I believe they did. Yeah,
right. I love that. Honestly, I love Joe Pesci in that movie, but that's like, I've only found one recording of David Ferry's voice, and he had a voice like this. It was so deep, it was crazy. It was like a super deep voice.
Really,
not like Joe Pesci whatsoever. So it added a whole creep factor to it for me.
He looked like him though, man. Oh my god.
So Hoffman, the deaf dude on the overpass, Bushy describes the eyebrows and David Ferry, and then him tossing the gun to a guy dressed as a railroad worker, and that was Blackman.
Yeah.
And he disassembles the gun and puts it in the tool box and walks away towards the railroad.
Right. Yep. That's how you do it, because I think those guys knew they couldn't get out of there. There was no escape. They had to just blend in.
So would Ferry have had the fake Secret Service credentials? What do you think of that whole story?
So.
Or there were people who were shown credentials or said I'm a police officer or I'm this, I'm that.
I have a burgeoning theory, but I'm not wanting to talk about it yet. I need to do some more research, but I have something in mind that might explain that. So, but we can say with certainty there were a couple people who gave Secret Service identification, like Edgar Eugene Bradley. Edgar Eugene Bradley was accused of providing Secret Service ID, which is weird. Edgar Eugene Bradley is one of these Minutemen type who was associated with Hall and Howard and Seymour out in California. So, plus he was connected to a Dr. McIntyre, who was like this dentist who was like a far right guy, and a couple other people out there in California. So his connection to me is interesting. Why he was there is interesting. How did he know to be there? To me is interesting.
Is this Braden who was arrested from Daltex?
No, Edgar Eugene Bradley, a different guy. Edgar Eugene Bradley, yeah. So Braden was a courier from Meyer Lansky. So
this other Bradley guy, where he was arrested in Dealey Plaza?
I think he was questioned, and then he was questioned, not arrested, and then Garrison tried to have him sent from California for trial.
I see, right. Yeah, and then Jim Braden, a.k.a. Eugene Hale Brading, is a different guy. He's a mob courier, and he was in Daltex floor 2.
Yeah, so the Daltex stories are nonsense. Like, there was no phone for anyone to use on any of those floors.
Yeah.
The only phone on the 3rd floor was inside you had to go inside the Maryland Belt Company and then use their personal phone, which was on the wall. And so nobody was doing that. And if they were doing that, then what's the deal with Maryland Belt Company? I think that was one of those. Maryland Belt Company was owned by Bloom or Jaffe or one of the Sam Bloom or one of those guys. One of the guys connected to the assassination. I forget which one it was.
So you think
Morris Jaffe was like the owner of one of the owners of the building, and he owned a bunch of the businesses in there, and he was the best friend of Lyndon Johnson.
Isn't that where Zapruder's the dressmaking office was?
I'm not sure what floor that was on. He might have been
Daltex.
Yeah, it was definitely in Daltex, but he might have been connected to the Maryland Belt Company because I remember his Maryland Stiltzman was his assistant. So
do you put Braden as like a spotter in the building for a shooter, or what do you think?
No, I think they had a ton of people go there just to watch.
Oh, he's just there to watch it.
I think they did that on a large scale. Because when you go through Hank Albarelli's work, you'll find that the Corsican guys that E. Howard Hunt talks about in his deathbed confession, Hank Albarelli traced them into Montreal and then down to New York and then down into Texas. So they were there for sure, 100%. I think they flew.
Doesn't mean they had a rifle in hand, though.
Correct, 100%. I don't think they did. I think they were just there to muddy the waters. I think when they knew the FBI, they knew that the FBI would do. They knew the FBI would pull travel records and all this stuff. They knew the FBI would find that there was 30 assassins walking around Dallas at the time. And they're like, oh my God, what's happening here? Right. So like when when Oswald allegedly was in Mexico City.
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item. Plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.
Another guy who was in naval intelligence named Oswald with two S's, Osswald. He was sent to Mexico City at the exact same time our Oswald allegedly was. And his job was to go to college campuses and hand out anti-communist flyers, right? They went and interviewed him because his name popped up on the list, right? Then there's a Mexican guy named Osvaldo who was involved in some stuff. So these guys like planned this out in advance. Like they knew this.
They flooded the zone basically.
Exactly. And that's what they did in Dealey Plaza. They flooded it with people who were known mob associates, known hitmen. God. The Corsican guys were definitely there. Otto Scorzani was definitely there.
Yeah, Scorzani features pretty heavily in Coup in Dallas.
Yes.
Was he connected to the other guy? Willoughby. Yeah, was he connected
Willoughby? That I don't know. That's all in Coup in Dallas.
I'm getting through that book, man. It's dense. That's a good book.
You got to read this one. I've only gotten about halfway through, but the Scorzani Papers by Ralph Gannis.
I need to read that. Yeah.
Those two books are kind of like they were in communication with each other when they wrote those books. So it's really even two different authors. It's really like a 2-pack of books.
Who is Scorzani for the audience?
Scorzani was Adolf Hitler's bodyguard.
Jeez,
he was the architect of of false flags and dark art stuff like this.
He was in Dealey.
Yes, he was in Dealey.
What puts him in Dealey Plaza?
Hank Albarelli showed he was in Dallas at the time, and I found a picture of him in Dealey Plaza. He's the only guy 6'5" with an inset jaw, staring over the whole crowd. He identified in a later interview in Life. He identified the Knoll shooter as being codenamed Max and Zed. And now I have found a third reference to this Knoll shooter being codenamed Max. It appears in Mary Haverstitch's book, I Know a Woman. So I'm convinced that, because I also have documents showing that a hitman named Max met with Jean-Pierre Lafitte and Frank Sturgis at No Name Key. So to me, it all connects. Wow. And the introduction was made by Santos Trafficante, who Valenti's family had worked under in Tampa before they moved to Houston.
So that's the code name for Valenti?
Yeah, Max and Zed.
Max and Zed?
According to, I can't find anything on Zed at all, but there's another Jewish hitman named Max who there's been articles written about and stuff. It's not him. It's a different Max.
And now you put Lauren Hall in the depository?
Absolutely. So Lauren Hall's involvement, you got to think, I mean, Lawrence Howard, clearly the shooter in the sniper's nest based on the statements of Arnold Roland, who puts him up there with the dark complected, possibly a Mexican, possibly a Negro, but he had something wrong with his face. His face was heavily marked in some kind of way, the pockmarked face. Exactly. That's Lawrence Howard. And if you know that, then who's his buddy on the 6th floor with him? It has to be Lauren Hall. Then we have the story of Richard Johnson and Richard Hathcock and the Johnson 303 that was picked up by Hall from his Allied Detective Agency about a month before the assassination. Then he goes and tells Hathcock that he's going to Dallas about a week before the assassination. Then somehow the FBI finds that rifle or finds out about that rifle, and within 24 hours had gone to LA to talk to Hathcock about it. So to me, it's clear that Lauren Hall was the man who was seen by Velma coming out of the back of the building about 3 minutes after the assassination. So it's interesting how it happened. When you look at the timing of the witness statements, you've got Sergio Arcacha and you've got Lawrence Howard and Lauren Hall coming down the elevator after the power's been turned back on by William Shelley. They come down in the elevator. William Seymour, who's working in the building as Oswald, because I don't have any evidence Oswald ever worked in that damn building. I don't care what he said. I don't care about none of it. Okay, there's no evidence he was ever there. And so once you realize that 3 guys come pouring out of the back door within about 30 seconds of the assassination, one of them walks into Dealey Plaza, 2 of them get into Green Nash Rambler station wagon and pull off. What that indicates is Lauren Hall hid in the building for about 3 minutes. He stays inside for 3 minutes. How does he do that unless he feels comfortable in that building? Because he was supposed to be there, because William Seymour was working there as Oswald. And William Shelley and all those guys were in on this, right? William Shelley killed the power to the building.
Was Shelley also on the street in New Orleans handing out flyers with Oswald? Or,
that
picture, it looks picture, like him.
It does. It looks like him. A lot of people said that was Thomas Beckham.
But he was old OSS, right? He was Intel connected.
Correct. But he did work. But I got to give him this. He worked for the Book Depository from 48 onward. I mean, so
that's a long
time. I don't really see them sending him on covert ops, or maybe they did. I don't know. But that looks like him. It doesn't really look like Thomas Beckham to me. I don't know.
Haven't you dug up a photo of Lawrence Howard in Dealey Plaza?
Yes. That came out at Gary Shaw's 1967 book Cover Up. So you have Roger Craig, who will meet with Jim Garrison. Roger Craig will see a photograph. Jim Garrison will show him a photograph. It's of a heavy-set Cuban-looking guy with disheveled hair. And Roger Craig identified that man as the man who was driving the Green Nash Rambler station wagon.
Roger Craig, folks, was Dallas Police Department.
Dallas Sheriff, yeah.
Sure, and he was Policeman of the Year in like 1960 or something.
Right. So. And he ends up getting murdered. So
yeah, that's a whole story. There's actually a whole book about that, I think, called The Sheriff's Deputies, or I forget what it's called, but there is an entire book on him.
So there's another guy, Richard Randolph Carr, is the guy who saw them pour out of the building and go into the station wagon and pull off. Richard Randolph Carr had multiple attempts on his life. And in the story of Richard Randolph Carr, during one of these attacks, he allegedly killed one of his attackers. There's zero information on that incident at all.
No shit.
Yeah.
Was he the one who saw Buell Frazier come in the back with the...
No, that's Ed Shields. Ed
Shields. Okay, he was at the rear gate that was like across the street or in an auxiliary building or something.
Yeah, he's at the warehouse on Houston Street, because the Book Depository used to be housed in the Daltex, but then they moved in July of that year, only 6 months before the assassination, long after the assassination had been started to be underway. Right, so the whole thing was planned around that building. And in all those,
Bird owned the building.
D.H. Bird owned the building, and everybody in there was a CIA contractor. All the publishing companies. You got to think, the CIA controls the textbook industry. They are not going to allow the propaganda to start in schools be wrong. So they're going to put the narrative in textbooks. That's how that goes. So,
Mike, you sent Cory that piece from the Florida newspaper about Lauren Hall's stepsons.
I think I did, yeah. And you were in touch with a friend of one of Lauren Hall's stepsons, right, Cory?
I had exchanged a couple emails with a guy who was asking me some questions, and he told me that he read my book and he was going to go and see Lauren Hall's stepson. And then I was like, I sent him a whole list of questions and stuff, and I was like, hey, get in touch with me. I'd like to have a conversation. And I never heard back from the guy. So
interesting, yeah, because that article was fascinating. There's a Mannlicher Carcano that Lauren Hall left with the stepson, and it ended up being from the same stock.
Well, the shipment of Carcanos, it was a batch of 70, and it was imported by Adams Consolidated, and that was owned by a CIA guy named Samuel Cummings. And so I know that there were at least 3 of those rifles in New Orleans at one time. David Ferry was seen with one. Emilio Santana was seen with one. And we don't know if they're from the same batch, but we should assume, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah. Cummings is connected, Eric, to that document that was going all over Twitter last night. From the Ramparts article in 1967.
Oh, Samuel Cummings was?
Yeah, Samuel Cummings is mentioned as his Americo or I forget the name of the company. But anyways, the document basically said this is a guy who had done some work for the CIA.
Interarmco,
yes.
Yeah, that was it. That was the company in Virginia that all the weapons that got stolen from the bunkers that went to 544 Camp Street and Guy Bannister, they got sold to Interarmco. And we know that because of Gordon Novell. Gordon Novell spilled the beans on that.
And they ended up in Israel.
Yep.
But the guy, Eric, was in that. Let me see if I can pull it up, actually. He ended up dead like 6 months later, Eric. This is the thing you were telling me about that came out in the
Underhill?
files. But Underhill, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
You
I've
know
heard
about him, Cory?
I've come across the name a couple times before. I haven't seen that document, but that story is not new.
That was an interesting document that the day of he fled D.C. for New Jersey, saying this was a clique of CIA madmen that killed Kennedy.
Right. Yeah, that clique involving the top guys in the whole thing.
Right.
You know, there's no way Dulles and Angleton didn't know. There's just no way.
I mean, Dulles is the master of covering his tracks, though.
That's what I tell people about. That's what I tell people about guys like Dulles. Like
he was at the farm, though.
They don't need to know details. I think that was debunked. I think that was recently debunked.
Really?
Yeah, there was contradictory scheduling stuff that basically
some researcher got a hold of his records in Georgetown, his calendar in Georgetown University or somewhere that kept his papers, and they saw.
Yeah, I've seen that, but I think there was something else that came out just recently, actually, that was contradictory.
But you were saying a guy like Dulles doesn't need to be in the weeds of the details of the operation.
Exactly.
Is what you were saying.
Exactly. He doesn't need to be in the weeds, but he did seem to know enough. Like when you go through the Warren Commission testimony, there's times when Robert Oswald starts talking about some sensitive stuff, and then Dulles is like, "I think we need a break." You know, so he knew enough to know when to shut the witnesses up, but he probably didn't know the ins and outs like someone like Angleton would.
He was pretty jokey about the Bancroft connection, though, too. He was like, wow, if they knew that I knew your husband's mother's friend, or, the Ruth Payne connection that Dulles, he knew enough to make a comment about that.
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item, plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.
Yeah, the Ruth Payne stuff is interesting. I mean, she was obviously working with the CIA as some low-level something. She attended some college in Tennessee that Oswald is alleged to have shown up at when he was supposed to be in the Marines. So there's some weird connection there I haven't really figured out.
Like that was when he was there to give a talk about his time in Russia, or just
no? That was in Alabama. That was in Mobile, Alabama, and that was set up by John Moret, So John Moret is in on this scheme with Oswald also. When you look at the Beauregard photograph of Oswald, the early one, that's not Oswald. When you look at the photograph of Marilyn Moret and Dorothea, and Marilyn Moret and her mother Lillian, and there's another picture, allegedly it's supposed to be Oswald, but he's got his arm around Lillian and he's wearing a white button-up shirt and he's got a big smile on his face. That is not Oswald. Oswald was withdrawn. He didn't like affection. He didn't touch people, hug people, none of that stuff. So when I see a picture of a guy said to be Oswald with his arm around Lillian Moret, I'm like, what are you talking about? There's no way. And that relationship wasn't that kind of close where he would do that. So we have another person in the mix here who I believe was John Eugene Moret, the youngest son, who was the one who met him in Mobile, Alabama. That's a whole nother rabbit hole that I've been working on. And it's crazy.
Have you come across anything about a phone call that happened years later where the guy claimed to be Oswald or claimed to be, or it could have been the other person who was posing as him? Have you seen, you know what I'm talking about?
There's a story that's told by Mae Brussels, who was like she was the OG Kennedy researcher, and she had gotten a bunch of anonymous money for a long time, like $10,000 over a couple-year period. And she goes out to her car, and she's got this guy with her, and a guy approaches them in the parking lot and goes, "Do you know who I am?" And they look at him and they go, "Damn, you look like Lee Harvey Oswald." And they go and they have dinner with him and they talk to him for a couple hours. And he like recites like Oswald's communist speech to them that he gave when he was like on some radio show. And they tried to get him to give like hair samples for DNA and all this stuff, and he wouldn't do it. His name is Donald Orestes Norton, and I don't like facial recognition because it's not accurate all the time. It's very hit or miss. I've run the same people. I know are the same people, and it said they weren't. But I got an 80% match to the original pictures of Lee Oswald for Donald Norton. So I don't really put any stock into that because the CIA was playing games with body doubles. So who the hell knows who that guy was, you know? But it's possible. You never know. I can tell you that the man who was killed on November 22nd was not the man who was born Lee Harvey Oswald, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the footage of him and the photos, and he's all beat up. I mean, he just looks completely shellacked and shell-shocked. I mean, he just, like, when he's given the press conference and they're like, you have been charged. You have been charged with killing the president. I mean, and the look that he gives, you know, like, you know, he was obviously involved in something, but.
So I think he went to New Orleans, and I don't know what they had him doing in New Orleans, but every job that he had was a CIA-connected job, from the Standard Coffee Company, which owned Riley.
Yeah.
Know, all of the jobs that he had were intelligence-connected, one way or shape or form, which tells me they weren't real jobs. They were front jobs, meaning he probably didn't even have to show up. He probably just got a paycheck. You know what I mean?
Jaggers.
Charles, Jaggers Charles. Like, I'm sorry, is a defense contractor who develops the U-2 photos going to hire a former defector from from Russia? Give me a break. It's just so dumb.
He's at the pool party there with the dude from Collins Radio and DeMoore and Tshirt, right? And the summer before.
Yeah, it's so that's another thing. Like, George DeMoore was an anti-communist. So why was he hanging out with a communist?
What's he doing hanging out with a young, poor, broke, pro?
But I think Oswald, when he was sent to, mainly when he was sent back to New Orleans in that April-May period of '63, I don't think they had him doing anything, and I think he was frustrated. And I think he is like, "What the fuck am I? What am I doing here? What's the hell's going on?" I'm supposed to
he may have thought he was doing something, but he was just really just being spun around. I mean, like. Because his favorite TV show was I Led 3 Lives.
Well, actually, John Armstrong debunked that. John Armstrong looked over the time periods when that show was released and when Robert Oswald would have lived with Oswald in order to be able to know that, and it didn't. The numbers didn't jive. The show came out much later. It came out in '56, and he was already on his way to the Marines then. So
he wouldn't have been able to sit around all day and watch that.
Right. Yes, Total Lies by Robert Oswald, and it makes you wonder why Robert Oswald's making stuff up about his brother.
Well, he lived to old age.
He sure did.
I mean, then again, he was dogged by it. I've read interviews with him, and I think he just had a bricklaying company or a brick company.
He worked for the Acme Brick Company, but the Acme Brick Company seems to be another one of these intelligence contractors. There's a brief period he actually is documented that he worked for Convair, which would go on to become Lockheed, I think it was, or General Dynamics, or one of those.
Oh, Jesus. I haven't seen that. I would like to see.
At the exact same time he was working there, another guy was working there named John Oswald, who was related like a third or fourth cousin, but allegedly they didn't know each other. John Oswald also had a military background. So when you go through the Oswald story, you find there's other Oswalds involved. Like when he goes through the Marines, there were Clyde, Clifford, and Clayton Oswald all went through the same courses around the same time that Oswald did. And so you get a lot of people come forward and say, hey, I knew Oswald in the Marines. And then you listen to the description, you're like, that wasn't our Oswald, right? So I think they did this stuff on purpose.
I mean, that's a unique name, man. You don't really see that last name very often.
There were 3 Oswalds who worked for Standard Coffee Company. Both of them related to Lee Harvey Oswald. At the time, Oswald worked there, and neither of them said they knew him. So that's another weird one. William Oswald and Julius Oswald both worked at Standard Coffee Company. So what does that mean? Who knows?
So when do you think it really hit the Lee Oswald that we see in custody that he was fucked?
Probably at that moment on TV when he found out that. I think really when they arrested him in the theater, he had to have known. He's not a dumb guy. I mean,
yeah,
he had to have known. I don't believe that person was connected to any of the people in New Orleans other than Kerry Thornley and possibly Clay Shaw. Definitely not David Ferry or those guys. They would have kept him away from the operation. You don't want to keep your patsy in the middle of the operation because the guy's smart. He's going to figure out what you're doing to him. So,
break down who Dave Yaris was and how you place him on the pergola, right?
Yeah, for sure. So the Nix film was edited to crop out a shooter, and so when you go through all the statements, it was a process of elimination because Dave Yaris and Lenny Patrick are 2 of the longest-standing Chicago hitmen. Period. They were involved in the assassination of Anton Cermak in '33. Back when Dave Yaris was only like 19 years old. And so Dave Yaris was an OG. And the FBI is monitoring these guys, of course. They lose track of Yaris about a week before the assassination, and they lose track of Lenny Patrick too. They don't know where they're at. Both of them resurface in Chicago about 4 days after the assassination. So that tells me they were both in Dallas. Then when I go through the stories of Jack Ruby and Bertha Cheek and the real estate stuff that she was involved with, you'll find that week of the assassination, she rented out a place to two guys, David Leon Miller and Isidore Max Miller. The problem is Dave Miller and Isidore Max Miller had moved to Atlanta like 6 months before. They were not in Dallas. They were in Atlanta. They were interviewed by the FBI. They were in Atlanta. Then I find documents indicating that Isidore Max Miller is a big shot in the numbers game in Dallas. No, he wasn't. The big shot in the numbers game in Dallas was Lenny Patrick via Jack Ruby. Okay. So then once I see all these factors coming together, it was like, oh my God, they were there using their names. So that's how I put them in Dallas. Dawson agreed with me. He came to the same conclusion. Putting them on the knoll was really because you have a film immediately after the knoll happens behind in the railroad yards. And to me, it's clear as hell that it's Dave Yaris walking in the back with a white shirt on and his neck that's kind of hunched over. Lenny Patrick. So there's Lenny Patrick. Here we go with this story. A lot of people think Robert Bernard or Bernard Baker was at the knoll, right? Or Bernard Barker, who was involved with Watergate, right? And somebody saw him getting into a truck and leaving, but he showed some sort of identification, and then they let him go. It was cops stopped him. But when you put a picture of him right next to Lenny Patrick, they're identical. They could have been brothers, glasses, bald head, the whole 9 yards. So to me, it was pretty obvious that was Lenny Patrick, not Bernard Barker. So yeah, this is investigations. There's never a clean cut smoking gun. You have to. This is how cops put together cases.
Well,
they take the evidence and they look at it and they're like, okay, that's what happened. And then see a cop though, in a modern case, would have the ability to pull someone in and interview them and use their techniques to get a confession or whatever. We don't have that luxury anymore, so we're stuck with the basics.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Who was the other Dallas police officer that was kind of with Westbrook all day? What's his name?
Kenneth Croy.
Now Croy was actually like right next to Jack Ruby when he shot Oswald in the basement, right?
Oh, was he? I haven't spent any time on that shooting at all.
Croy claims that he tried to stop Ruby from shooting Oswald, and if you look at the pictures and the photos, and he's identified right there, Ruby just brushes right past. It could have been Croy that led him into the basement.
Well, Ruby was in the basement for hours before the shooting. He had been seen in there on the elevator about 9 o'clock in the morning, and so you have the story about the money order that was purchased. He didn't purchase that money order. He couldn't have because he was in the basement. So who could have purchased the money order?
His brother.
There you go. Who everybody seemingly knew as Jack Ruby. All that whole weekend, Jack Ruby's in two places at once, constantly being seen in two places at once. And his brother was most certainly providing alibis for him because Samuel Ruby looked almost identical to Jack.
They weren't twins, but they were very close in age.
Yeah, they were 10 months apart.
I heard too, Cory, that Jack Ruby, to any of his associates or anyone he was talking to that weekend, said that I will be headquartered and you can reach me at this, I think it was a radio station or somewhere, which is actually owned by a close childhood friend of David Atlee Phillips.
Well, it's funny because the radio stations, that's a whole other conversation. But when you start to dig into the radio stations that were involved in the assassination, more particularly WSHO in New Orleans, that was actually owned by Hank Greenspun, and who owned the Las Vegas Sun newspaper. And that's a fascinating backstory, which I didn't find in any Kennedy files. I found in some old Radio Digest information. Basically, The CIA, WSHO was a small privately owned family radio station, and the CIA in the 50s, for some reason, went on a buying spree of buying up radio stations. And this guy wouldn't sell. So he sent Jack Martin and a couple other guys to go rough him up, and eventually he sold to Hank Greenspun. So that's the story of WSHO, which was used as part of the alibi for David Ferrie and his Winterland stuff. And then WDSU, obviously, CBS, CIA. So yeah, all the radio stations are connected to intelligence somehow for some reason.
And I think it was either Bloom or someone from the Dallas Citizens Council who basically said to the Dallas police, let Ruby come down there because he'll be able to translate for the press. If the press has any questions that are
Yeah, for the Israeli press. He was supposed to be there with 2 Israelis.
Yeah.
No one's ever identified them. No one's ever actually showed clear pictures of them. But I looked into that for a while, and it was kind of a dead end.
Yeah, that was interesting. I read that recently. But there's a lot of threads. And, guys, we're coming up on 90 minutes. We want to be respectful of Cory's time. But, Cory, we want to have you back on. We'll do it again sooner if you come back on. I want to have other researchers on and do some volleying and bounce some ideas, because you've dug into crevices that a lot of people have not. They don't know to look at, and they refuse to look at. And it's very impressive. And people, you can check out Cory's book, A Warning from History, at coryhughes.org. Highly recommended. And I understand you're working on another book. Are there any update on that?
Well, I'm going to start on my Harvey and Lee book pretty soon. It's going to be the unbelievable story of Harvey Lee Oswald. And it's going to basically correct all the mistakes Armstrong made and add a whole bunch of new stuff to it.
And Armstrong has passed away?
Yeah, he died in 2021, I think.
Wow, a lot of the OG researchers are getting up there in age or have passed away. So, Cory Hughes is carrying forward the flame of truth, and we appreciate your time, Cory, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Cory, and everybody listening. I put all of his links in the description below. So go to his website, buy his book, support his work. It's essential trailblazing work in the field of the Kennedy assassination and geopolitics overall. And if you like what we do, make sure you subscribe to this channel. And if you want to support us, go to patreon.com/Jackman Radio and become a monthly patron. So we thank you all for listening and tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you very much.
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Does this podcast make you happy? Of course it does. That's why you're here. But it only comes out once a week. For happiness every night, you need Adam and Eve. Yes, I'm talking about sex toys. It's cool. You have earbuds in, right? Adam and Eve, America's most trusted source for adult products, has been making people very happy for over 50 years. With thousands of toys for both men and women. Just go to adamandeve.com now and enter code IHEART for 50% off almost any one item, plus free discreet shipping. That's adamandeve.com, code IHEART for 50% off.